Right to the point, I have read 364 fantasy books, and here is my top 10 most addictive fantasy authors. The ones that will keep you up reading until 2 a.m. and then jumping right into the next book. Note, these are not necessarily the highest quality fantasy books. They're the most addictive fantasy books. Number 1, Brandon Sanderson. In particular, any books in the Cosmere, but honestly, anything Sanderson writes is wonderful. I am a huge Sander fan, and I'm going to be describing a lot of other books in relation to Brandon Sanderson books. The characters are just so human. The magic systems are so creative and specific about what you can and cannot do with magic. And the plots, that Sanderlanche of just all of the plot lines coming together in the end and all the pieces fitting together, they're awesome. If you haven't read Brandon Sanderson before, I would recommend starting with the Mistborn Era 1 series. Number 2 is Pierce Brown's Red Rising series. Technically, this is sci-fi, but it reads like fantasy and it even has sword fights, so I'm okay with including it in this list. It feels a lot like Sanderson's Mistborn Era 1 series, or like Hunger Games, if you must. I don't really like Hunger Games that much, but it is described like Hunger Games a lot. It's got your protagonist from the underclass who's thrown into the surprisingly violent world of the nobles and has to try to overthrow the whole system. But the really standout part that makes these books great isn't the plot, it's the characters, and especially the protagonist, Darrow, who manages to be full of rage and full of heart in a way that's genuine and believable. Normally, you only get one or the other. You get that cold, hard, deadened character who's just, I am what the world made me and now I have no soul, which is great. Or you get your sensitive soul who has to somehow survive in this cold, harsh world, and those are fine too. And often when you try to get characters that have a bit of both, they don't seem really believable. Whereas these books show you exactly how it can be done, how it can be done well. I love these characters so much that it bothers me because I'm a very logical person and I just can't describe why it is I love them so much, and that's very frustrating. As a bonus, the first book in the series is currently free on Audible, at least in Australia. And a big thank you to YouTuber Daniel Green for recommending this book. It made me very unproductive at work for a few weeks. I actually had to recruit some friends to help me enforce a ban on these books in my life for a couple of weeks in order to get some work done because I was in danger of just completely failing. They are just that good. Number 3 is James Islington? I do not know how to pronounce that name, and I have heard it many different ways. But anyway, the Licanius trilogy, weird in fantasy that the fantasy elements are easier to pronounce. The Licanius trilogy is completed and amazing, and his next series, the Hierarchy series, has book 1 out, and I cannot wait for the next books in the series. Islington, that's what I'm going with, is the closest I've seen in authors other than Brandon Sanderson to achieving that Sanderlanche avalanche of all of the plot points all coming together and fitting together in the end. Does that very well. I have not found any issues with all of the intersecting plots. The magic systems that he uses are not as hard and explicit as Sanderson's magic systems, so it's very much the Sanderson plot style. Which does make sense because Islington initially started writing after being inspired by Sanderson's Mistborn series, so it makes sense that you'd see similar types of books to him. Though I do think the new series, the Hierarchy series, and book 1, The Will of the Many, has a real Red Rising feel to it as well, with that righteous rage combined with compassion and heart. So I'm hoping that I see even more of those elements in the rest of the series. But generally, overall, everything he has written, wonderful, very addictive. Number 4 is Joe Abercrombie. Everything in the First Law universe is wonderful, and if you're okay with YA, everything in the Shattered Sea series is also wonderful. Note that these are not like Sanderson. They are gritty and dark. Even the YA books are gritty and dark. And that's not normally my thing, but my god, the characters! They are so human and flawed, and they just dig their claws into you, and I hate them, and I love them, and I hate that I love them, and I cannot put the books down. I do often, when I finish an Abercrombie series, have to go reread a Sanderson book just to get a little bit more happy into my brain, but these books are excellent. The magic in the books isn't really a big part of the story. They're much more political. They've been accurately described as Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, but faster paced. And personally, I really love the Northmen. So the Northmen have these names that they've acquired in battle, like call signs, and I do Viking reenactment sword fighting. And we do have a lot of fighters who have these names that they've acquired through our various events and gatherings, so that just seems really realistic and cool to me. And if you're wondering, my name is Bloody Rainbow. I got it when a guy who didn't know my name was saying that he kept dying to that bloody rainbow girl, and the name stuck. Number 5 is Michael J Sullivan. I got this recommendation from ChatGPT, which I think is pretty awesome. So Sullivan has 4 different series that all take place at different eras within the world of Elan. They're all addictive, they're all very good, but I would recommend not starting with the Legends of the First Empire series. So Legends of the First Empire takes place thousands of years before the main original epic series. And a lot of the value that it does have comes from kind of answering some questions that you would have had from that original series. I also think it's just the worst quality writing of the bunch. It is still addictive, it did still keep me up reading and immediately jumping into the next book, but I think a lot of that was because I was already so invested in the characters. I would recommend starting with the Rhaenyra books. So Rhaenyra is a name for this thieving duo. So there are 2 guys, Royce and Hadrian. They are highly skilled thieves that do special jobs within this world, and they are what I'm calling a Rye Wisdom duo. So if you loved Wax and Wayne from Sanderson's Mistborn Era 2, you will probably like Royce and Hadrian. They're a lot of fun. And they are the core characters for 2 series. There's the Rhaenyra Revelations and Rhaenyra Chronicles. So Rhaenyra Revelations is the original series that Sullivan wrote. It is your standard fantasy epic, save the world overarching plot over all of the books. And then Rhaenyra Chronicles were written because the characters Royce and Hadrian are just so awesome. So they're a more episodic series of books that just go over some of the jobs that these 2 have done in their history before the events of the big main epic. So they're prequels, but they're, 10 to 20 years prequels, not 2,000 years prequels. And either way, both of these do focus on Royce and Hadrian, Rhaenyra, that amazing duo. Chronicles is probably better writing, so Sullivan, you can really see the improvement in his writing as he goes through writing more books. These were written after, they are better books, but if you're a stickler for publication order, or if you really need that epic save the world plot, then Revelations is the place to start. A couple of extra notes. A lot of Sullivan's work is currently free on Audible, at least in Australia. There are a few books from the Legends of the First Empire series that are free on Audible. Note, that's the series that you probably shouldn't start with, but hey, they're free, so add them to your library now, and then when you get to them, you'll say, oh yay, I got these for free. And a couple of short stories from the Rhaenyra characters. These have no spoilers for the rest of the series, and one of them, Professional Integrity, is, I think, Sullivan's sharpest writing. So a really good way to get to know these characters and see if you'd like to invest more time or money in the rest of the books. So Professional Integrity follows the characters of Rhaenyra, great introduction, and Sullivan's best writing, I think. I'll also note here that I would not put Sullivan in a top 10 list of best quality fantasy books. There are issues with the writing, there are issues with the plot and how the story comes together, and sometimes some consistency book to book. But that's not what this list is. This video is top 10 most addictive, and even with all of those flaws, the characters are just really fun. You want to hang out with these characters, and the books are addictive. Number 6 is Will White's Cradle series, not his other books. Cradle is silly and fun and fast-paced and feel-good. It is not gritty, it is not deep and meaningful, it's not serious, it's just super enjoyable. If you have been in a rough place or you're just not in the headspace for something like Abercrombie, this is totally opposite end of the spectrum. This is just fun. It will make you smile, it'll make you laugh, it will absolutely deliver a super enjoyable reading experience. Will White's other books, some of them are still quite enjoyable, some of them I will say are a great demonstration of how an author's skill can improve with time and practice, but Cradle is just perfect. Number 7 is Kelcade's King's Dark Tidings. I bought this book because it was on sale and the cover looked cool. I'm a sucker for a dark rogue assassin in the night. And I genuinely think more people in real life should wear cloaks and hoods because that looks very cool. I would be very okay with this. Basically, I thought this book was going to be bad in a good way, a bit like The Witcher on Netflix, where there are flaws, but it's enjoyable. And honestly, it went way past my expectations. There are some serious flaws with the story. I hate spoilers, but I'll just say that there's one sort of central premise that doesn't work. There's no way that this character would be able to do what they do while also not understanding this other concept, and that kind of breaks down most of the story, but that's okay. I can suspend my disbelief on that because it's just so enjoyable, so addictive to go through these books. Interestingly, Kel's other series, The Shroud, she started writing that series after, and it is better quality writing, more creative ideas, more nuanced characters. It's better, but it's just not addictive in the same way that King's Dark Tidings is. It gets ya. And if you liked Xaden from Fourth Wing, you will probably fall in love with Rezkin from King's Dark Tidings. Though note, in making any comparison to Fourth Wing, King's Dark Tidings is much less graphic and less sexually explicit than Fourth Wing. So it's different kind of writing, but similar character attributes, and I love them both. Number 8 is Robin Hobb. Anything she writes is wonderful, and her style of writing makes me feel like someone is telling me this story while I'm sitting around a campfire. She's also really skilled at subtly including some themes that are very relevant in the real world, but in a way that's not like pushing ideas on you. It's just inviting you to maybe have a think about them. I particularly love the way that fatness is handled in the Soldier's Son trilogy, because as much as fantasy includes all sorts of bizarre looking characters, the real world stigma around fatness is pervasive enough to get into even fantasy worlds. There seems to be this rule that you can have a portly, jolly side character, but that's it. Like you can't, like, fatness still has such stigma attached to it, even in fantasy worlds. And this series sort of forces you to look at that and think about that. The series also included what turned out to be really accurate descriptions of how a town full of people would react in a pandemic. I genuinely had to go look up and confirm that the books were published before 2020, because it was just like, it felt like I was reading the news, but for a fantasy town. The Rainwild Chronicles is another series from her that I think includes some really great, subtle, real-world relevant aspects. It's got this wonderfully positive and healthy presentation of embracing and owning sexuality from a female perspective that's hard to do without just over-sexualizing your characters. So this isn't a woman using sex as a weapon, or this is a more coming-of-age story, and it's not a Disney romance. It's not about finding Prince Charming. It's about this character having her own experiences, and it's just done really subtly and really beautifully. I really like it. Note, if you are interested in that, Rainwild Chronicles is the 4th series in a sort of set of series that take place all in the realm of the Elderlings. So if you do want to get into that, but you want the whole experience, then I'd recommend starting with the Farseer trilogy. Book 1 is called The Assassin's Apprentice. You can, however, jump right in if you don't care as much about publication order. They are complete series in themselves. They just do sometimes have references back to events that have happened in the other ones. So you can read the Rainwild Chronicles. I'm a sucker for publication order. I would start by reading the Farseer trilogy. I will note her writing does sometimes have a sort of tragic beauty feel to it. It's not gritty and dark like Joe Abercrombie. It's not got that raw edge to it. It's more of a sort of resigned acceptance of flaws within the world, but can have a similar effect that I'm not always in the right headspace for reading her books, and sometimes I can't quite binge through them because they just start making me feel sad. Number 9 is Daniel Abraham's Dagger and Coin series specifically. Note, Daniel Abraham is one of the authors behind the pen name James S.A. Corey, which is the author team for the Expanse series, very popular in sci-fi. He does also write as a sole author, and I'm a particular fan of his Dagger and Coin series, which initially seems like pretty standard epic fantasy, but it's got a couple of really nice tweaks on the standard ideas. It's also got another one of those great wry wisdom duos, like Wax and Wayne from Mistborn Era 2, or like Royce and Hadrian from the Rhaenyra Chronicles. And I hate spoilers, so I won't give too many details, but I'll say I particularly love the way these books explore what happens to your traditional unpopular loser kid becomes fantasy protagonist after that initial moment of glory. Because, yeah, you've got, like, yep, you're hard done by, then some sort of fantasy thing happens, there's some magic, there's some whatever, you become this hero character, and after that, things don't have to go one particular way. There's still multiple paths that could be followed, and I think he does a really good job of making his characters still deserve what happens to them, whether that's good or bad. I'll also add, he does have another series, Kithamar. I've read book 1. It is good. It's not addictive, though. So Dagger and Coin is addictive. It's a great series. And number 10. I have to include it. Rebecca Yarros's Empyrean series. So that's Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and the other ones that will follow. I have so many issues with these books. I literally have to have my notes open. I have a note on my phone as I'm going through these books, just making note of all of the things that annoy me and make me roll my eyes and grrr. But I also can't stop listening to the books. So I can't stop until I finish them. I stay up way too late. They are addictive. There are major flaws with the story, but they are addictive. They're bad in a good way, like The Witcher on Netflix, and there's a reason that they're so popular. It is a romance book series, so that does change a lot about how it's written. It's very graphic, very sexually explicit, and I would not recommend it to everyone. It is actually the best of the romantasy series that I've read, the romance fantasy. I have read a few, more than just these, and it's not my favorite subgenre, but this is the best of those that I've read, and again, I did get hooked. I will absolutely read the next book as soon as it comes out, so it's gotta make this list. And now for some honorable mentions. Jim Butcher's Codex Alera series, but not Dresden Files. I'm not a big fan of those. Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicles, Scott Lynch's Gentleman Bastards, George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, and Naomi Novak's Scholomance are all quite addictive series. I just couldn't fit them in my list of top 10. And of course, so many other authors will go into future videos of different kinds of best fantasy books. I mean, Terry Pratchett is not on this list, despite being absolutely one of my favorite fantasy authors. But this list isn't about the best fantasy books, it is about the most addictive, stay up till 2 a.m. fantasy books, and sometimes that means the junk food of the genre. I also want to say, please, let me know your recommendations and favorites. I have an insatiable appetite for fantasy books, and I'm always looking for new recommendations. Also, hi! I hate wading through all of the intro stuff at the beginning of videos, so I thought I would put that at the end. So hello to anyone who is still here. I am Kiara Brueggemann. I am a doctor PhD of biomedical engineering. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the Australian National University. I am a proper mad scientist. I genuinely use nanotechnology in the lab to make artificial brain tissue to be implanted into brains after stroke or brain damage to help regrow damaged tissue. I'll probably put a link somewhere in the description if you're interested in any of that. But specifically, I'm mentioning it now because I want to say that I have done the traditional academic formal route to become an expert in something. I am an expert in biomedical engineering. But you also know the saying, it takes 10,000 hours to make you an expert, and I thought I'd give that a try. So I want to become an expert in fantasy books, and I am at, bing, 62%. So about a year ago now, at the beginning of 2023, I was seeing lots of posts on social media of the piles of books that people read over the previous year, and I thought I'd keep track of my own reading. I do audiobooks, so for me it's ear reading of all of these books. It means that I don't have bookshelves full of the books that I've read. There are no piles, it's all just on my phone, so I don't really notice how many books there are. But it does mean that I can count up the hours really well. So looking through 2023, I read 1,672 hours of new fantasy books, over 2,000 hours total across all of the books. So I'm about 80% fantasy in what I read, or ear read, what I consume in books. And then I went back and added up my entire library of books, and I am at 6,230 hours of fantasy books. So that makes me about 62% of the way to being a 10,000 hour expert. Ooh. And I decided, journey before destination. So I'm not an expert yet, but I do want to get to 10,000 hours. I think that's a cool goal, and I want to document my, experience as I go through becoming an expert in fantasy books, unofficially. Making the specific effort to find new authors and new books in 2023 has already expanded my fantasy brain so much. I'm finding new subgenres, finding patterns of what makes good and bad books, seeing how different books kind of can influence each other, and I think as well, growing as a person. This is something I think people who don't love fantasy will say that fantasy is so unrealistic, it has nothing to do with the real world. And I really think that's not quite right. It's more like a controlled science experiment where in fantasy, everything is so different from the real world except people. And because everything else is just so bizarre and so weird, the only thing that's real in the books is people. The way people can affect each other, feel about each other, interact with each other. It really forces you to focus on that without all of the biases and preconceptions that you get in the real world. So if you have books that include real world characters who have a certain political view, or live in a certain town, or like a certain brand, or eat a style of food or something, it's really difficult to separate that person from all of the biases and preconceptions you have about all of the other aspects of their life. Whereas with fantasy, no one has a deeply ingrained bias about whether the original knights radiant from millennia ago were a force of good or a force of evil. You can just see the characters as people and empathize with them as people and see how their actions affect other people. And when I see myself in these characters, I can really see how I have the ability to affect other people, for good or for bad, and have genuinely had some real personal growth experiences coming out of seeing myself in fantasy characters and really not being able to hide behind any of those other biases, to just see the human elements of it. Honestly, I think sci-fi and fantasy are the most human genres, specifically because everything else about them is so weird and bizarre. It's like having a cartoon zoom background, so the only thing that's real is the human, and you have to focus on that, and you learn more that way. Anyway, my plan is to focus on one subgenre every month throughout this year, and do little videos, read a few books within that subgenre, and maybe take advantage of the fact that I work at a university campus, and I'm surrounded by official experts in many topics, to invite some to talk with me about themes that come up within the books. For example, when going over the romance fantasy books, I would love to ask a psychologist why it is that I love all of these dark, brooding characters in fiction, but never date anyone like that. Could also talk to some real historians about how accurate certain aspects are within medieval-themed or sword and sandal type fantasy books. I mentioned that I do reenactment sword fighting. Let me put some pictures there. So I do have contact with a lot of experts in historical military tactics, as well as fighting styles with different weapons, and I'd love to talk about that in a fantasy context. And definitely I have lots of things to say about magical academies. As a university lecturer, I would really love for someone to write a magical academy series where it's the teachers who save the world. They're the ones who are competent, and they have to do it despite all of the annoying students asking for changes to their grades and extensions and all of that. That would be lovely. I am, of course, very keen on all of your recommendations as well. I've got 3,800 hours left to go before I'm an expert, so I am ready to learn from the community around me. Please tell me your favorites. In particular, January, I'm focusing on progression fantasy. I really haven't read much progression fantasy before. I think just Cradle series. I've started just today reading the Mark of the Fool series, which was recommended by Google as a good progression fantasy series. So if you have any recommendations for progression fantasy, and it's still January when you're seeing this, please let me know. Or if you have any recommendations of your favorite fantasy series, please let me know. Again, I have a huge appetite for these books and thousands of hours to fill with more fantasy. I want to know more of the fantasy. Let me know.